third person perspective.
Welcome to the Third Person Perspective Podcast. All right. I'm your host, Kenneth B. Douglas, and I'm excited to share my insights with you today. As a coach, philosopher, speaker, my goal is to help people find meaning and purpose in their lives. Through a combination of introspection, observation, and reflection, I aim to guide individuals on a journey of self discovery. Today's episode focuses on exploring the dilemmas facing today's youth. In this episode, we'll dive deep into the often overlooked perspectives on this critical issue. So let's get started. So, question: how can we learn to see the big picture and truly understand the challenges faced by today's youth? It's a question I've been pondering for some time, and it's one that requires us to step back in order to take a broader view, right? The third person perspective. Recent studies have shown that the challenges facing youth today extend far beyond the commonly discussed financial and educational struggles, right? I don't think they really think about that kind of stuff, not like us older people do. In fact, a significant portion of today's youth are grappling with a profound crisis of identity and purpose. So let's first take a look at some statistics. According to a 2023 survey by the Pew Research Center, nearly 40% of respondents aged 18 to 24 reported feeling lack of direction and uncertainty about their future goals and aspirations. This perspective highlights the emotional and psychological toll that the modern world is taking on our youth, right? All of this stuff going on, and they're going, well, what is this? What's going on? What's happening? And they didn't do it, they didn't cause it. But I'll get to that in a second, right? As they navigate a rapidly changing social landscape, intense academic pressures, and an uncertain job market, many young people find themselves struggling to maintain a sense of self and purpose. So, a 2022 study published in the Journal of Adolescent Health found that over 60% of young adults reported experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression, with many citing a lack of guidance and support as a contributing factor. So I know from my day job that there are lots of organizations. And so now I want to get into the meat of it. Okay. And the title of this podcast, right, is Dilemma for Today's Youth. So let's talk about why we're here, the differences, and how we got here, because that's what I think is the meat of the issue. And I'm not going to say problem, I'm going to say it's an issue, because I think it's just the way that time and circumstance has made this time that we're living in come to fruition for the older people and the younger people, for everybody on the planet, right? So, generation characteristics and differences. The greatest generation. So, when we start talking about generations, we usually talk about the greatest generation as the first one. As not like they were the first generation in time, no. But this is where we start talking about why. Because probably they're the only ones, they're the last ones still alive, right? This generation, the oldest people are, there's a handful of them left that are still alive, right? Because they were born in 1901 to 1927. So someone born in 1927, right, would be 102 right now, right? So that's they're the 100-year-olds and plus. Anyone born before that. So there, like I said, there's a handful of them left on the planet right now. So, how do we understand them? So, these are the people who survived the Great Depression and lived through and fought in World War II. Some of them were very young when they got drafted into World War II or got sent, but they lived through the Great Depression, and that's a very key moment. That was a very hard time for America, for the whole country. And so they were hardened because of that. And they were very prudent, they were modest, very strong work ethic. They were named the greatest generation because of their resilience. Okay. Had to put up with so much, they had to endure so much, and they're known for their resilience. So that's why we call them the greatest generation. Their motivation centered around family, community, country, and they were patriotic. Okay. I'll bring that up later, but they were patriotic. Okay. Parents of the baby boomers. They were the parents of the baby boomers. Okay. We know we like the young people like to throw around boomers, boomers, boomers. Well, they're not the greatest generation. They were their parents. Okay. And they're the grandparents of Generation X, which is my generation. All right. And Generation Z as well. That's the greatest generation, the first one, born 1901 to 1927. The next generation is the silent generation, the traditionalists. They were born 1928 to 1945. Now, you probably don't usually hear about the silent generation. So it goes with their name. It's kind of funny, but you don't usually hear about them. 1928 to 1940, named partly for not rocking the boat. Okay. They kept quiet. That's why they call the silent generation. Now, why did they have to do that? After World War II, it became it was not a good idea to talk bad about America. Let's put it that way, because it was the beginning of the Cold War with Russia, right? America had dropped the bomb to end the war and all of this stuff. And actually, America and Russia were kind of working kind of on the same side, we'll say, as far as ending the war, as far as the world wars were concerned, the axis of evil and then what became the UN nations and stuff. But what happened was, like I said, the silent generation, they knew that they couldn't talk out about this because remember, the greatest generation was very patriotic and they went through hardships. So they weren't going to do any bad mouthing about the USA. So that's why they had to kind of not rock the boat with that. So because it was very un-American to do, like I said before. So they experienced extreme swings in depression and the Dust Bowl as children, to the economic prosperity boom as young adults post World War II. So they kind of, as children, they saw the Dust Bowl, and then all of a sudden, after World War II, America hit a boom, and they kind of got to experience that. So they saw a big swing between for things in the United States. Um, they started families and became homeowners at a young age. The economy allowed for this. So, in their early 20s, 30s, they were buying homes and starting families and stuff like that, which is not as prominent today. They enjoyed stability and benefits of rapid corporation expansion. So, this is the time in America when corporations were starting and booming and growing. They weren't as big and we didn't have as many as we do today. So, next generation, the baby boomers. All right. This is the famous group that everyone likes to talk about and blame for everything. 1946 to 1964. That's when they were born. Post World War II. Named for the sudden increase in births from that time. Okay. So the GIs came back from the war. They were glad to be alive and they were glad that their women were still there. I guess most of them were. And everybody was making babies left and right, left and right. So it was a huge increase in the population in America at that time. So baby boomers. But during that time, though, when they came back, there was so many of them and so much was going on. It was a limited resources, jobs, and education for the baby boomers, right? Like I said, they were the children. I don't want to get that messed up. They were the children. The baby boomers are the ones who came back from post World War II, from World War II. They were competitive out of necessity. So this is kind of where it seems. I'm not saying for sure, but it seems like the competitive nature in America really started to take root, and it became kind of cutthroat, in the workplace, because they had to be, hard work leads to a better life. So that was, a kind of motto they were living by. If you worked hard, you got the things you wanted. So you'll see the baby boomers, they taught that to their kids, who was Generation X, right? They taught us that you work hard, you get what you want. And that kind of got implanted in us as well. Valued relationships with family and friends, goal centered, confident, and resourceful. And in their generation, they witnessed and were part of and went to the Korean War, Vietnam War, and they had the civil rights movement during their time. So a lot of things were going on in their time as well. So these generations, the baby boomers, the silent generation, and the greatest generation, you can see that they all went through times of conflict and hardship and war during their lives. And that was pretty much the end of that. There were no big world wars since then, Korean War, Vietnam War, we've had, the stuff in the Middle East, but none of it has been big as these prior conflicts. So now I'm going to talk about Generation X. And Generation X is my generation, but I think it's important because Generation X is the kind of middle generation between some mindsets, if you want to say. We're kind of in the middle, and I'll show you why in a bit. So Generation X, 1965 until 1980, raised with minimal adult supervision. Okay, we were called the latchkey kids because mom and dad had to go to work, right? The baby boomer, our mom and dad baby boomers, both had to go to work. Not the prior generations. It was just one person going to work and one person staying home raising kids. Well, now that was different with the baby boomers. Remember, it was hard finding jobs and getting money, so everyone had to work. So both parents had to work. The Generation X kids stayed at home, especially during the summers, obviously, but even after school. And we just closed the door, went out. There's a key under the, rug or something like that or somewhere. And we went roaming the streets, miles away from home, just doing whatever we could figure out to do. That was our entertainment. For you young people out there wasn't no video games. TV was very limited, a few channels, and not near as entertaining as it is today. But that was it. We rode our bikes and we played in the dirt and just did all kind of things to figure out if we could do them. That was us. So, so not only were we latchkey kids, but it was kind of during the birth of the technology age. Okay. So when we were kids, not quite yet cell phones, not smartphones quite yet, but technology was starting to develop. They were talking about computers and things like this. And I remember when I was in high school, when the Commodore 64 and stuff started coming out, and it was a big deal for someone to have one of those. And video game consoles started coming out, just real bulky, primitive looking things, that are antiques now and probably really valuable. But that was our age when we were young. So we were hyper independent, like I said. Not only were we latchkey kids, but we had to come home and make ourselves some dinner and get ourselves ready for school and all of those things. So hyper independent. We had to figure things out. That was the key thing for Generation X. That is why we butt heads with Generation Y, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we had to figure things out. There wasn't no, hey, dad, can you show me how to do this? A lot of us didn't have dads, especially in the African American community. So while mom and dad were at work or just mom or whatever, we had to figure out how to fix things, how to figure out things, do our homework. If something happened at home and, we've been shown this and that and it didn't work, we had to figure it out. That was it. So, and because of that, we became very adaptive. Okay. A bit adaptive to most situations. We could, like I said, we learned to figure it out. So we got good at it. But for some reason, one thing that came with our generation was we became very materialistic. And I remember early on in when, computers and internet was going uh, booming in, what was I say, the early 90s or so, that this is an image that shows you Generation X. Unfortunate. There was a woman posting on social media somewhere, probably in the late 90s. Yeah, late 90s, early 2000. And I could tell she was Generation X. She looked about my age, but she was posting, she had a new car. She was happy about it. So she, sitting on the hood of the car in front of it and saying, the caption said, I got my new Mercedes, so happy. And you look at the car and it's a BMW. So, so we were so materialistic. Some of us weren't even paying attention, but it was a big deal to have that car, right? Because at the time, that was a $50,000 car. That was big money. She wanted to show that she was rich or she had made it, and that was important. And we know that materialistic mindset still pervades us today, not with just Generation X, but that's kind of where it seemed to have started with our generation. What are you going to do? Also, with our generation, we worked hard and played hard. Okay, so on top of that materialistic mindset, we did work hard and play hard. So, all right, the next generation, like I told you, we butt heads with is the millennials or Generation Y, born 1981 to 1996. So they witnessed technology expansion and the communication boom. So by the time they came along, technology was rolling and they were all about it. You know, they were able to figure out the technology stuff where Generation X was still trying to figure out. They were just like, oh, yeah, let me look at that. And even though they were younger, they just grasped it a lot quicker. But along with them came a demand for morality and value systems, especially at work. So we're Generation X, we were just like, we were just going to go to work. We were going to do stuff and get paid and go have a good time and spend our money and stuff. And we didn't worry about the dynamics at work, things that were going on at work that weren't right and all of that. Well, Y came by and they were like, no, we're not going to put up with that. They started demanding things be better at work and they questioned everything. That's why Generation Y fits them so well because they were like, why? And Generation was like, because that's the way it is. And they were like, that's not good enough. Why? You know? So they were good at asking the why question. Um, they had access to technology and communication since birth. I said that. And they were the global generation. They started to be able to connect worldwide, whereas Generation X and before we could not. Identity searching and diversity including. So they were the first generation that kind of showed us that they were kind of looking to find out who they were, just on their own, just naturally. And they were very quick to include diversity in their lives and accept it. Whereas the older generations, we were kind of, shelving ourselves off from other groups, whether we meant to do it or not. That's what was going on. They were more open, accepting, and collaborative than the other generations. So we see that competitive thing that I talked about with the baby boomers starting to melt away, right? Demanding social autonomy, workplace values were more important than competing for salary. Like I said, the values were more important. The baby boomers and Generation X, they kind of came up with you had to compete at work. Well, not Generation Y. They didn't want to do that. It was just, you know, uh, saw it as something that just wasn't needed. So we can see the polarity between the silent generation and generations Y and Z. Generation Z, the I generation, born 1997 to 2010. They had access to technology and communication since they were born. So they were the global generation. They were connected worldwide. They were the first generation to be able to talk to their friends in other countries and stuff and learn and connect and know more about people, kids in America talking to kids in India and China and Japan and Philippines and Australia and learn that they were actually the same as them. So had the same problems. They were identity searching and diversity including. And this being able to reach out to the world probably uh, helped with that, probably encouraged that. They were more open, accepting, and collaborative. And like I said again, it was probably because they were able to connect with more of the world. The time had come and it was all happening. They had social autonomy. They had workplace values that were more important than salary. Okay. They were more interested in getting along and fairness and all that kind of stuff at work. They didn't want to compete with their peers. They felt like everyone should be paid a good amount for what they do at work instead of I'm going to get paid. I'm going to step on you and rise up. And, they didn't want to do that. That era of competition that came from the earlier generation was disappearing in them. Okay. So those are all of the generations, the greatest generation, all the way to Generation Z. And we see the differences in how things progressed with them. So we can see polarity between the greatest generation and the silent generations and Generation Y and Z, the first two and the last two. So the former not only had little to begin with, but had to survive world wars and economic struggles, right? They had so much to deal with. But the latter, the last two, were born connected to each other and the rest of the world through technology and had no idea what a world war looks like or feels like outside of a video game. So that's not a dig at them. That's just the way it, right? The greatest generation and the silent generation, they just, I mean, world wars were going on and stuff. I mean, Generation X, we don't even know that, right? So understand how big of a difference that is. The boomers set the stage for the future by increasing the general population, and maybe one result was scarcity, right? There's so much, many more people, especially in America, that it was, a little harder to get the necessary things for life, food, jobs, services. It was just, the population boomed so much that things were just harder to get. And we see how the population is in the US right now, right? It's huge compared to what it used to be. Life's much easier. So when the older people, the boomers and older, talk about, oh, this used to be, well, a lot of the things were simpler as far as the population is concerned. Even though they experienced social revolution, America was still heavily involved in global wars. So that's, during the boomers' time, you know, we still have conflicts and stuff going on, but they still had to deal with surviving in America and, Vietnam, Korea, all those kind of wars, etc. Generation X was the last to be born with the shut up and do your job DNA baked in. Okay. So, and that's what we ended up telling the Generation Ys. That's why the butting of the heads happened. The Generation Y would say, well, why? Well, because of this. And they would go, well, that don't make sense. No, that doesn't make any sense. So why? And if you just shut up and do your job. And they didn't like hearing that because that wasn't a good enough explanation. So we learned, Generation X learned to figure out things on our own. And like I said before, both parents were working and the kids spent the day unsupervised. And like I said, we were so used to figuring out things on our own, we figured the next generation is like, that's what we'll teach you. You just figure it out. And they didn't they didn't want to do that. They wanted an answer to questions, because they figured we knew. So Generation Y immediately asked that question to everything, frustrating us, like I said. And we figured that they understood, but there was no way to bridge that gap as far as the understanding. Generation Y was just a different generation and they required different inputs. We couldn't just do what was done to us from, the boomers and our grandparents. So they needed answers and we didn't give them to them. But at the same time, they didn't have solutions when they were always asking why. They wanted things to change and asked why, but they didn't have solution. And that was the big part that frustrated Generation X. So they immediately refused to listen and get in line like we were trying to tell them to do. But they were in questioning things. Even though they didn't have a solution, they were right in questioning. Now, the later generation, Generation Z and afterwards, they started having solutions. But the problem was no one was listening to them, right? So, Generation Y wasn't interested in the old ways. Um, and the parents or the older siblings tried to raise them, but it wasn't working anymore. So, Generation was too young to know why themselves, but they just knew it wasn't for them. Okay. Z, right? And like I said, Generation Z they seem to have a different template for success. And gone was now the ways of the old thinking that came from the boomers and the greatest generation and the silent generation and Generation X, right? That was gone. The old things didn't work and they knew it and they just weren't going to do it. So they didn't come just asking why with no solutions. They just started basically shutting off from us, you know, and that's what we're talking about today. So, the youth are faced with the dilemma of dealing with problems that they did not create. That is their dilemma today. That's what I believe is their dilemma. Now, I'm not speaking for the youth. I'm not speaking for my generation. I'm not speaking for the older generations. I'm just saying what it looks like from what I have seen. So to me, it's no wonder they don't want to, excuse me. To me, it's no wonder that they don't want to participate. Okay. Yes, of course some do, but in general, they would rather just kind of back into the background and stay up late and play their video games and connect with their friends around the world who understand them because the older generations they know that we don't. Most of us aren't even trying, right? It's shut up and do your job. Shut up and do what I said. So, but they're too advanced, if you want to say for that. Minds know that things should be different or things shouldn't be the way they are. And I'm talking about with the outside world, with the political world, the job world, and money and social things going on. They know that a lot of the things that are going on are not right. So these are the problems that they did not create. So, and what are those problems? Poverty, climate change, gender inequality, unemployment, healthcare issues, human rights issues, corruption, pandemic that we all had to go through, lack of education or good education, access to education, immigration issues now, big time, inflation, aging, food insecurities, violence, it goes on. So, I did a study online and I found that top three concerns of young people today, the top three worldwide concerns. So, and those are coping with stress, right? Coping with stress. It says the number of children aged 3 to 17 diagnosed with anxiety grew by 29%, and those with depression grew by 27%. So, it's important for young people to learn healthy ways to cope with stress. So, coping with stress is huge for young people. It's huge for older people. All of us deal with it. But to have these young people today coping with stress at such a young age, that says that there's a lot going on that they're frustrated that they have, they can't do anything about. And that's not a frustration that I remember dealing with when I was a young kid. It was just, I figure out what I'm going to do today because I'm not going to see mom, you know? But all the things I mentioned before, they have to deal with and they see it at a young age. So it starts to wear on them. So that's a stress builder on top of the daily life that they have to live, right? Dealing with friends, dealing with family, school, whatever they have to do on a daily basis to survive, right? So, and that goes into the second concern of youth worldwide. So, mental health issues are a significant concern for youth today. Globally, 1 in 7 10 to 19-year olds experiences a mental disorder, accounting for 13% of the global burden of diseases in the age group. Hmm. So, and then it talks about suicide is the fourth leading cause death among 15 to 29-year olds. So that is staggering that youth are dealing with, stress, and then it leads to mental health issues. And of course, I'm not just blaming it on, the stuff I'm talking about, but there's just so many things going on. And these are the main concerns of it. And then the third one, worldwide concern for youth today is their body image. It's a major concern among young people. Studies show that kids as young as 3 have body image concerns. Now, where do we see the age of 3? We saw it in coping with stress starting at age 3. All right. kids 3 years old dealing with stress and worried about their body image. So no wonder by the time they reach, 7 or 10 years old, they're dealing with mental health issues. So on top of that, guess what we have? What did I mention before? This world has all these problems, right? Political, social, and they didn't make them. They just came into this world and it's just like, all right, you have to deal with this stuff. And it's hard to see a future when it looks so bleak. Once again, the topic of this podcast is the dilemma for today's youth. Okay. So, top three concerns for young people today in the US: housing affordability. Okay. As of March 2022, about half of Americans, 49%, said the availability of affordable housing is a major problem where they live, up 10%, up 10 percentage points from early 2018. Now, it's the time of this podcast. And I see where I live, and anytime I go outside of where I live, all over the country for years, I've seen big lots being torn down and like, oh, what are they putting there? Another apartment complex. And on top of that, buying a house is becoming harder and harder because the interest rates are higher and the housing prices are rising. So, okay, well, I'll just get an apartment and rent. Well, that's what's going on, is because it's not that one's going to be better than the other. The apartment rental prices are almost the same as a mortgage. So, a lot of people, no, not a lot, a few people are getting rich off of this issue, and it's stressing out not only the older people, Generation X and above, but it's not stressing us out as much because we've already had houses, we've already been in houses, we've already built equity, built savings, those kind of things. But the young people don't have any of that. They're just starting, and they're like, "How do I figure this stuff out?" I have to get a regular job just to barely survive and get a place to rent, and they keep raising my rent price, and I'm barely making it. So I can't see buying a house like my grandparents and my parents did, you know? So it doesn't make any sense to them, the world that we live in, right? The second concern with young people in the US is income and social mobility. So I just mentioned that with the housing, right? Individuals born 1980 have only a 45% chance of out earning their parents at age 30, compared to 90% for those born in 1940. So that that pyramid or that tree or whatever, that the younger generations are going to do better, well, that seemed to have ran out, because that's what happened, right? Each generation, by the time we got to Generation X, kind of did better financially and socially than the previous, but then it just kind of stopped, and now it looks like it's, financially, it doesn't look good for the younger generations. And I think we can all see why, especially with the things going on in the political scene. You can see everything is tied to money. And there's the few people who have a lot of money off the suffering off of the many people. And unfortunately, that scenario keeps playing out over history over and over and over again. And we're living it right now. And the youth, they're having to deal with this. So the third and final one for concerns of young people in the US, is mental health. So that's the worldwide one, right? Mental health issues. Read you one statistic. In 2021, 51.7% of US women received mental health services, while only 40% of men did. Okay. I think those numbers are way different now. I'll look at them and see in another podcast. But yeah, young adults ages 18 to 25 in the U.S. have the highest rate of experiencing any mental health concerns, 33.7% compared to adults aged 26 to 49. And the highest rate of serious mental illness is 11.4%. So mental health is a big concern. A lot of things going on in the country, in the world, a lot of things that just us adults, us older Generation X and boomers have to deal with. And the younger generations is like, oh, instead of just learning, grow into adulthood and, find their way and stuff, they're having to deal with grown up issues, right? Like we have, but we've had experience at it, but they were kind of thrown into it and having to deal with some of the issues that we were able to learn over time. And it's like they don't have time. It's like it's just there and they have to deal with it. So that's the dilemma, right? So, what can the youth do to mitigate this problem? So, mindfulness and meditation practices have been shown to have numerous benefits, both for mental and physical health. Okay. And we just from this report, we've seen that that's the main thing, mental and physical health. So, it reduces stress and gives improved mental health and physical health benefits as well. Mindfulness-based interventions can improve physical health as well and help with emotional regulation. Mindfulness meditation um, is research proven to reduce stress, and we just have to get the youth a little more involved in it to mitigate some of all the stuff that they're having to put up with, so that they can rise to the occasion. I'll say. And what I mean by that, the world is being handed over to the youth at some point. At some point, all the old people won't be old people anymore. They'll be gone, right? And this is, for those of you who are youth listening, this is going to be your world to take, just in case you've forgotten that, you know? And the question will be, will you follow in the footsteps of what's gone on before you? Now, I think in a broader sense, I think the mindset is, of course not. As we saw with the differences in the generation, how you were thinking and everything, how we were thinking, how they were thinking, and how you were thinking. It, it's evolved. It's turned into a different thing. Problem you have, some of the younger generations are being groomed by some generations that are doing some of the things that are causing everybody the problems. And you have to resist and fight against that and rise above that. You can't let the few end up taking control and speaking and controlling the lives of the many. I don't think anyone wants this game anymore. So you guys are born into these problems. This is the dilemma you were born into. But it's not the dilemma that you have to live through. You can rise above it, you can challenge it, you can fix it, and you can be the heroes that we all need. All right. Turns out, you know, um, I see the youth as the band aid to the world's problems, because I think you have the right mindset. You were born with it, and you were born with technology to be able to reach out and see that the rest of the world is just like you. There really are no differences other than the languages. And a kid in America, just like a kid in New Zealand or a kid in Britain or a kid in India, knows that the things going on in the world that are affecting them eventually, they're not right. So when you get the opportunity, or if you have it now, you you want to do something. And this is an encouragement for you to do something. Whatever it is you can do, say something. Social media is there. Young people are entrepreneurs these days. So, a lot of you have your own podcasts and thing. I see a lot of people in the political arena speaking and challenging the older adults. Do it. Yes, do that. Okay. Be like Bobby Boucher in The Water Boy. When the teacher was telling him about the medulla oblongata, and he said, "What?"
No, Colonel Sanders, you're wrong. Mama's right.
All right. Us boomers, us older people, we're Colonel Sanders, okay? So you tell us we're wrong and you fix the world. All right. I think you can do it. I have confidence in you. And that's all I have for this podcast. I hope we were able to share some information, and I'd hear from you. hear your thoughts on this. Like I said, I'm not speaking for the younger generations. I'm just talking about how I feel, what it looks like when I pull away, in a more third person perspective sense and look at everything. And I hate to see that the world is the way it is for you, but I have confidence that you have the ability to one day bring the world back into balance and back into order. So I look forward to hearing from you. And that is all. Be sure to vibrate higher. Have a good day.